on the ANC. Of course, it goes into its policy conference this weekend, a big gala dinner happening this evening. And of course, there's a lot to contemplate for the party. Renewal, unity, rooting out corruption, money troubles, as we've just heard from Pule Mabe. There really is a lot for the party to tackle. And of course, let's not forget, just 2 years before our next general election. I'm joined now by TK Pawe, Public Policy Specialist at Wits School of Governance. TK, thank you so much for joining us. So you heard Pule Mabe just saying, well, we can actually pay salaries now. I wonder what you think of that, because on the one hand, it's good that they are being very transparent. On the other, it's deeply unsettling that the governing party of this country has massive money problems. Do you buy where Pule Mabe puts the blame on the Political Party Funding Act?
Evening, Sunny, and thanks for having me. Well, look, I think it's not so much that I buy it as though it seems like a repetition, because if you go back to the previous policy discussion documents of the ANC in 2017, there's actually a section which actually details that, listen, we actually need to get better, and part of getting better as being a modern political party is paying staff. So the key question we have to then ask is the ANC a very, very slow institution to learn lessons? Or really, and I think this is probably more truth than anything else, when it comes to the issue of funding, the ANC really does not have a clear idea as to how to tackle the new environment. And it's not really new, even if you consider the new acts about how funding is supposed to go. Because if you go back to 2017, the party still had these issues of being unable to pay its workers.
Talk to me about what's likely to be achieved this weekend. I think for people who are not absolute news junkies and people who love politics, they look at this and they go, well, they're going to talk about policies they've had. They might tweak a few here or there. What's really going to make, what difference is it really going to make to me sitting at home in my life?
Oof. Should I give you a truthful answer? Or
yes, always, please. I'd like a truthful answer.
I think truthfully, I think it's a bit of a misnomer when they actually call it it's an ANC policy discussion. Because really, these discussion documents have been, I think for the last 2 months have been circulated. That's where the discussions were supposed to take place in branches and regions and also at provincial meetings. But I think what we've seen leading up to this policy conference over the weekend is that there's been more about elections than actual policy discourse. For instance, I think the only thing we're currently hearing, and I think it speaks maybe true of KZN, is the decision about the step aside. Well, that kind of masks the bigger issues within the ANC. For instance, the ANC has not had an economic development policy for the last 2 decades. The ANC has not been focusing on rural development and townships in an articulate and data-informed manner. The ANC has been very behind the times when it comes to looking at evidence-based policy making. So what people should expect is that there's going to be pseudo-discussions, that there's going to be a lot of ideological rhetoric about where the party needs to be, being the motive force of society, that very lovely language. But in terms of actual policy discourse and evidence, there's going to be very little of that. And I think this has kind of characterized what the ANC has become, a party of ideology, as opposed to being a party that actually concentrates on pure public policy issues, which, like you're saying, the bread and butter issues of how is it that in the 2 decades the ANC has been ruling, that only Joburg, Pretoria, and Durban are still the centers of the economy of South Africa, and that rural South Africa and township South Africa has actually been put to the periphery.
So is it a situation where what's kind of said behind the scenes and the undercurrents that are swirling perhaps around the leadership contest that's coming in December is going to be perhaps more interesting?
I wouldn't say more interesting, unless you mean interesting in the British sense, which is to say it's very boring and very mundane.
No, I mean, actually, that's the real stuff, isn't it? I mean, really, what's really at play here is whether Cyril Ramaphosa is going to survive or whether there's going to be a big pushback. Could we start to see more of that at this meeting?
Well, I guess that's why I said that they're interesting, because for me, sitting as a policy practitioner, for me the policy is interesting. The policy gives direction to where the ANC wants to go, and I think it would actually help most of us if we actually understood ANC policy. I recently wrote an article where I said it's an apt description of this ANC document is I know you're a bit young, but there was a movie called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly back in the day. And I think this kind of describes the ANC policy document. And if I had to score it out of 10, it's 3 out of 10, because as I said, it misses the key things that are happening within society. And I think the fact that the ANC misses what's really happening within society kind of speaks to the deeper problem with the ANC, that they're concerned about who actually goes there, who becomes the next president. But as we've seen with the current president, that it's actually becoming a bit of a who cares who's the ANC president, because whoever's ANC president has to deal with a party that really is not au fait with what's actually happening within South Africa and what's happening on the continent. So that's why for me I think the real issue should be what is the ANC saying in the policy documents, and unfortunately they're not saying very much, and they're more focused on who's coming in, and we're going to do the song and dance again in the next 5 years where we're going to pretend there's a public policy discussions happening, but in real actual fact they just want to know who's next up to become a quote-unquote the next leader of the ANC.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because policy should guide decision-making and it should bear fruit. And perhaps the sort of jaded feeling one has when you hear about a policy conference is that it hasn't borne fruit. You seem to be suggesting that's because they're not great policies, not well thought out. So is that what's happening? Is it just that the policies are not actually acted on properly? They're not properly thought out? And that's why we end up in a situation where people tend to disregard this process.
I'll go a step further. A lot of the documents are actually repetition. Like I said, for instance, the issue of the ANC speaking about renewal. Now, when we mean renewal, I think we have to be very clear. How often can you renew a dead corpse? I think that's probably the apt way I would put it. Because they keep saying, listen, we need to change, we need to be a modern political party. But if you've been saying this for the last 15 years and you're not doing anything about it, that says to me one of two things. One, you really just want to put it out there as a way of saying, listen, we know that we've got problems, but just to make you happy, here's this idea of renewal. Or two, and I think maybe this is where we should really start focusing on, I think the ANC has a deep fear of actually admitting that, listen, when it comes to discussing policy and evidence around policy, we're actually very weak, and we've actually ignored this. And we've ignored it even to our own peril. So what we rather do instead is we'll give you a huge document which says a lot about nothing, rather than us actually saying, listen, we actually are stuck as the ANC in a moment where we don't know how to get our best and brightest into the room, how to actually make decisions for the betterment, not only of for themselves in a selfish way to be able to win elections, but also for actually reshaping and renewing, the South African landscape. So I think it's more of a fear. And I think until the ANC gets over this fear of being able to say, we are actually not good at making policy, none of what we discuss in these documents actually translates into what government does. Sometimes we take the sexy topics like nationalization or of the Reserve Bank, and we put it into public discourse saying it comes from our policy. But in actual fact, we don't actually know what that means. We don't know how that would actually translate into society because we've not quantified it and we've not actually spoken to society about these things. So this fear for me is the big issue around ANC policy making, why it's been failing, that they just don't want to come to the table and admit that, listen, we're not great at this and we actually don't know how to go about doing it.
One very quick question, because you love policy, clearly. It's your passion. So if you had to be given a magic wand and all the power, what big policy change would you make? What thing would you say, right, start here, this is the issue?
Two big ones. One, they need to move away from provincial government. Provincial government has no role in South African politics. It's actually a drain on the fiscus more than anything else. And it's actually taking us away from what we should be concerned about, which is my second point, which is to say all our policies at the moment really needs to be geared towards rural development and township development, and actually opening a pathway for South African state-owned entities, for South African business to actually become more of a bigger partner in the Southern African development community. Because South Africa's future, especially commercially, is not tied to the 60 million population we have, but it's actually tied to the greater region. But for that to happen, we need a government that is functioning, that has all the right apparatuses, and we need an ANC, if that's going to be the government, that is clear on such things.
Such an important point you make, and thank you for that, because I think a lot of the weekend might be taken up with the step-aside rule, which of course makes for interesting headlines, but we've got to make progress on these key areas that you've highlighted, and thank you so much for chatting to us this evening.